Go ahead, Ardina.
And hello, everybody out there. You are listening to 914 Wired. Happy to have you with us today. I'm Ardina Seward, along with Charlie Stern, Peter Moses, and our guest is Jason Minter. Jason suffered an unspeakable tragedy when he was 6 years old, along with his younger sister. His mother was murdered with a friend of hers in the presence of the children in upstate New York, in Somers, correct, Jason?
South Salem, you're close.
South Salem. Uh, the children had to witness this crime. Uh, there were three individuals involved. They were all captured within a few days, and they all went to prison. One of them died in prison, and two were released. Jason lobbied to get one of the individuals released, who was the driver of the getaway car, and the other person, who was the main perpetrator, was a Samuel Ayala. Ayala spent 42 years in prison. His sentence was 25 to life. And based on what some would argue as a rather liberal political climate, Ayala was released, even though he had been denied parole 10 times. He is now living in Yonkers, and he is a registered level 3 sex offender, which is the highest category you could register at. Jason ran into him. He ran into him
twice.
About a month ago. Ran into him twice in Yonkers, and they made eye contact, so they know each other. And it's basically an issue of Jason being re-traumatized. He lobbied to keep Ayala in, but they let him out. So there's not very much that can be done at this point. But there is a bill that has been proposed by a Senator Hoylman, Hoylman. I'm probably butchering the name.
No, you're not.
But it's an argument to release elder prisoners. Hoylman said at one point that prisons are not a nursing home. And Jason has a lot to say about that. So, Jason, I've talked enough. I'm going to let you take the floor.
Well, I understand where he's coming from to a degree, but where is the line? Does that mean anybody who, regardless of the crimes they've committed, can be released?
Well, the Brinks killers got out.
Yes, I understand, and police died there, and yeah, I would be opposed to that, based on the fact that law enforcement people were killed. In the case of my mother, I mean, the brutality of the crime was so intense, and Sam Ayala had lied at each and every one of his parole board hearings for years, and tried different lies, tried different reasons. Said that he was drunk in one of them and high, and then that was his, great excuse. And then another one, he said that he was not the ringleader; he was a follower, and he was afraid the two other men were going to kill him. That's a complete fabrication, because he was the ringleader and he was the one in charge of the situation. And then in the last hearing, he said that his mother and his sister weren't nice to him. So he was raging against women, basically.
So he's either a sociopath, a psychopath, and a liar.
Yes, exactly. Rather than saying I did these terrible things, I'm so ashamed, I'm a different person. He
passed the buck.
Yeah, he passed the buck, and
now he's a Yonkers resident.
Now he's a Yonkers resident.
So yes. I have a question for you that I read about this. Why did they break into the house?
Well, they were from South Norwalk, Connecticut, which was, down the road, 30 minutes away. And the day before, Ayala and Prophet hit some houses. I mean, they came to Westchester because they thought the houses were easy to hit. People wouldn't be home. It was, it's almost rural. It still is. I mean, certainly was then. it's not, sort of typical suburban, a typical suburban landscape. The houses are on, acres and acres of land. So they hit houses the day before, including a house across the street from the Watsons, and for years I thought, I thought perhaps they were looking for something or somebody. I no longer believe that. So the next day, they happened to James Walls, who was the driver, who is my friend at this point, was walking down the street. He was home from Massachusetts, and he was a friend of Prophet's. He'd never met Ayala, and they were in the van, and they said, we're gonna go hang out, and we're gonna go on a B&E, meaning a breaking and entering. He joined them. They looked around for places to rob in the South Salem area on March 2nd, 1977. They were driving very slowly down Route 123, which is also Smith Ridge Road. The assistant, my assistant principal who would become my assistant principal, my junior high, was on his way to the elementary school, Meadow Pond, there in South Salem. He was behind the van, and he witnessed it going slowly, and he thought it was odd, and then it stopped short right in front of 153 Smith Ridge Road, and it quickly made a left up the Watson's long driveway up to the house. He managed to sort of catch a glimpse of the license plate, or he remembered the first two letters, which was integral to their capture later on. I'm going off on a tangent here, telling you what
so
happened that day.
Why don't we focus on? So they came into the house to rob.
They came into the house to rob it. Yes, and they found Sheila Watson home with my sister, who was 3, and Sheila Watson's daughter, Nicole, who was 3. I was home at age 6 with Lucas Watson, 6 years old, who was Sheila's son and Nicole's brother. When it came time to drop Lucas off and pick my sister up, we couldn't reach them on the phone. There was a busy signal, and we drove over, and we walked in on what was happening.
And why did they shoot?
Why did they shoot? Well, Ayala said at one point he didn't want any witnesses, and one of the sharper commissioners asked him if you had, and they ran out of bullets, basically. And they asked him, if you hadn't run out of bullets, would you have killed the children? And he said, I can't answer that. He paused for a while. It was more dramatic than the way I'm describing it, and he had to be asked twice, and he said, I can't answer that.
So I have a couple of questions, and the first is more personal. You can put boundaries around what you're comfortable talking about. The second ties back into the politics that Ardina raised. You've had, you experienced this unspeakable tragedy, double murder, and but you were a kid, you were 6, and you've had a lifetime of, to think about it and talk about it and process it. It has to affect you on a daily basis to this day. How do you compartmentalize? First question.
You learn to compartmentalize. Yeah, you have to, otherwise, I mean, my life and my sister's life after my mother's death was not an easy one. We were abused emotionally, physically, and sexually by my father's second wife and her son, who was 3 years older than myself and 6 years older than my sister. We dealt with that for a couple of years, which, that in and of itself was pretty awful. We have a survival instinct, my sister and I, and we have just learned to put things away. Now, it doesn't always work. I get night terrors, and I think somebody's in the room, and I have alarmed windows and a gun and so on. So I have some paranoia. I certainly did as a kid too, but
yet you ended up working on maybe the most violent HBO show in history. You were someone connected to The Sopranos.
Yes, I was on the show for 10 years. A long time. Yeah, I never associated those two things together. And I was I loved horror films as a kid before my mother's death. And I remember us watching Nosferatu together, and her, making haunted house cassette tapes with me and so on. So I sort of had an interest in spooky things early on, and scary movies. And
And
anyway,
what was your role on the Sopranos?
I was assistant location manager for the first 4 seasons. Then I was David Chase's assistant for the next 4 or 5 years, and I had a producerial credit for a lot of that time. I basically was the liaison between the writer producer's office and the directors and the actors. That's what I did.
So
Do,
back
do,
to you. Go ahead, Ardina.
do you, you know, I think we've all gone through a religious process, be it Judaism, Buddhism, Catholicism, whatever. But do you think that there's any redemption for Samuel Ayala, or will he just leave this earth a stone cold killer?
I don't know. I mean, if I was to meet Samael, I would ask him. I spoke with his sister many years ago, and she told her mother died in the same way at the hands of another man in Chicago when Ayala was incarcerated, and we bonded a bit about that over the phone. And in the end of the conversation, I said, "Well, what did your father say happened that day?" And she said, "Well, he said he was a driver. He was outside the whole time. I know he didn't commit any violence." And there you go. So should somebody like that, and he's desperately trying to get to Texas to be with her and his family. She and I lost touch, unfortunately. I'm trying to find her again. I've been trying to find her, but we had a very nice conversation. So I don't know. What does that tell you about him? I don't think he should be around her or her children.
I want to be very clear about this, because that's a strange twist of fate, that Samuel Ayala's wife
Daughter.
Yes.
suffered
Oh, yeah,
the same
yes.
suffered the same fate as Jason's mother in a
Yes.
separate incident, and
Right.
he did not react overwhelmingly to that his own wife had been raped and murdered.
Well,
But
that happened when he was incarcerated. After he was incarcerated from my mother's murder. And
when
she
he was
lost his
incarcerated, but
yes.
that did not enhance his sensitivity.
Apparently not. I mean, I've never had a conversation with him. I've only received one ridiculously basic letter of apology that he only wrote when he thought he might have a chance to get out. He rebuffed my my advances for communication over many years, whereas even Willie Prophet I communicated with. He wanted nothing to do with me, and it was only when he thought there was a chance that he might possibly be released did he write this letter, but he continually lied during his hearings. So I don't know.
I have two questions for you. One is, you're stepping forward now. He's been out for a while. I have two questions. One of them is, what is your message for him? And the other is, what is your message to the prison system, for the parole system? Those are two different questions.
Well, I don't so much have a message for him. I don't know
Not
him.
for him. Yeah, okay.
Right. I mean, I'm curious to know him, and I'm curious to sit down with him and speak with him. I have a lot of questions. I mean, I have questions about my mother's last moments alive that I would love to know the answers to. As far as the parole system, I mean, it's very much. I mean, it's set up very much like the Supreme Court in this country. There are appointees by whatever governor happens to be in the office. So it tilts to the right or to the left based on how long a governor from either political party has been there. At this point now, I think there are only maybe one or two Pataki appointees left, and they're all Cuomo appointees.
Was Jennifer Arena one of those people?
Jennifer Arena, the person who really, Tana Agostini was the one who really prompted him, was really gunning to get him, pardon the horrible pun.
Jennifer would not have been. She would have been on keeping him in.
Okay. I don't recognize that name, and probably she might have been on one of those hearings years ago, but yeah.
So Ardina alluded to it. The elder parole is definitely on the agenda of the left and the state legislature, which clearly is now left leaning. How can you put the topic of the bill that I read basically was saying that over the age of 55, you should receive a parole hearing within a certain amount of time after or within 2 months, I think, of your 55th birthday, and 2 years. And if you're not paroled, you would have another parole hearing automatically 2 years every 2 subsequent years. That's
Right.
what they were trying to codify in the law. And I mean, I guess to kind of put some context around it, I think it's under the big umbrella of criminal justice reform. So maybe their thinking is that the oldest are the least likely to be recidivists. I don't know. What do you think of that? And is there any kind of a case for reform of elderly incarcerated people?
Well, shouldn't that all be sort of done on a case by case basis? I mean, not every prisoner is,
It's not one
is
size
equal.
fits
And,
all, right? It's not
right,
one
exactly.
size
I mean,
fits all.
look. Regarding what a mess the system is, Ayala, who raped, had a hand in raping two women and shot them repeatedly, as one of them tried to crawl away, as she was hit in the arm and the back and the leg, as she tried to crawl away, and basically admitted that they couldn't kill us children, 2 3-year-olds and 2 6-year-olds, because he'd run out of bullets. Why is he released in the same year that a guy was outside the whole time waiting for them, not knowing what was happening in the house? Why did they receive the same sentence in a way? Why were they released in the same year? I mean, it's absurd. That's absurd. It doesn't give me any.
It's a gross inconsistency.
Right. It gives me no faith in the New York State parole board at all.
When you ran into him both times, I'm assuming the reason you didn't want to talk to him is because how he might have responded, or were there other reasons?
Well, I have to tell you, at first I didn't know what I wanted. Honestly, I didn't know whether I just wanted to try to forget about it, which is obviously pretty much impossible. Forget about his release. Forget about the fact that he exists, in almost the same county that I do, that I work in the same town that he lives in frequently. And I actually only ran into him once. I thought I had seen him twice, but the second time it was not him. But the time that I saw him, I was driving down the street in which he lived, and I didn't expect to see him. I mean, what are the odds of that? It was 7:30 in the morning or 7:45 in the morning. There was a car double parked in front of the house, his address, and as I slowed down to pull past it, I saw him sitting there chatting with another man in the car, and they both looked up and they looked at me. And I pulled down the street, made a U-turn, and parked about 5 car lengths behind that parked car. And about 30 seconds later, I exited the car and looked at me, looked at the car, and then started slowly walking up the stairs to this house. The front door is up, I don't know, at least 30 steps up a hill, and every 10 steps or so he'd turn around and look at me, and then keep walking, and then one last look at the front door.
Do you think he recognized?
I think he knew it was me. Sure, I do. I think at that moment that he looked up in the car, as much as I knew it was him, he knew it was me.
And you've asked for a sit down with him, where you would like to just sit down with him.
At this point, yes. I didn't necessarily want that up until pretty recently, after I really thought about it. I thought about, what harm could come from that to me. I can't see any, considering what I've been through, the questions that I have, and so on. I don't expect him to agree to this, but I certainly would be civil, and yeah, it would be helpful, I think.
What do you tell your daughter about this, and how is she dealing with it?
My daughter has just kind of learned things through osmosis. I mean, she's 14. She's on the internet. It's not difficult. When Ayala was released, there were news trucks over here, and I did some interviews. So she knows what happened. She doesn't have any fear about it, thankfully.
Okay.
we live in an incredibly safe town. The police department is 10 doors away. The fire department is very, very close by. It's it's a really safe place, and it feels good to be here. That said, she knows that there's this family sort of darkness that hangs over us.
Ardina.
How safe is the public from Samuel Ayala? He's a level 3 sex offender. I mean, the guy's 70 years old, 70, 71 years old. Do you think that he's crime free at this point?
I don't know the answer to that, and I would like to get a sense of that if I were to speak with him. I don't know. I wonder who was that gentleman he was sitting with in the car? Was he coming back from a meeting at a church? Was he doing something else? I have no idea. I'm curious about all of these things. I mean, I know what James Walls is up to. We've had lunch and we talk about things and we talk about his life and his friends and so on. And I know who he is. But I don't know who Samael is. I know him as a monster.
And you
Ayala-
befriended
Ayala-
Samuel. Go ahead.
Ayala he was released during the pandemic, correct?
That is correct.
And did the rush to get people out of the prison have something to do with it? In
I
your
don't.
opinion?
I don't know the answer to that. I've thought about that a lot. I don't really know. It wasn't brought up in the hearing, so it's hard to say. I mean, I know that there was a push for that. But
Have you
yeah,
have you dealt with Yonkers police? Have you gone to see them and
No.
ask them questions?
I haven't, and I do have some connections to them, but I don't live there. And if I was going to be there for an extended period of time on a job, I might.
But he's a level 3 offender.
Yes.
Have you thought to inquire how often they check in on him?
Well, I know that he has to see a parole officer for life.
So
If he-
that's neither here nor there.
Right.
That's not people in law enforcement eyeballing him. That's just doing his due diligence in order to stay going back to prison.
Right.
So
Um,
So
how is he
that-
supporting himself? How is he?
It's a really good question. I have no idea. He's in a house that presumably has a number of apartments in it.
It's an SRO.
Right.
It's an SRO.
Jason, we think politicians maybe watch this show from time to time. They certainly come on. I don't know whether they watch. I hope they do. What would be your message to them?
My message would be: I think we need a parole board that they shouldn't be lifetime appointees. Perhaps they should be elected, or they should be chosen somehow in tandem with both political parties. It just doesn't work the way it's put together right now. It just doesn't. Didn't work for my family.
It should be noted that one of the main proponents of Ayala's release is a woman on the parole board who is
Yes.
married to a convicted murderer. I mean, the guy served his time, but she has a certain bias, if you will, towards men who are in the system for their release.
Yes.
Well, Jason Minter, thank you very, very much for agreeing to be on 914 Wired. We hope that you find peace and solace, and that this man never attacks anybody ever again, and that he's ostracized wherever he is, and he's watched. This is a very difficult subject, and we appreciate your honesty, your fortitude, and how you've lived your life, because you've led an exemplary life
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
after being so young and the victim of such violence.
And
Well,
to
thank
come
you.
On, come on here and talk about it. It's a service to everybody else. So
And
Very
Ardina,
brave.
thank you for putting this together today.
Well,
Thank you.
Jason is a very brave soul, and I admire him a lot.
No, thank you, Ardina.
that's 914 Wired for this week. Pick us up on wherever you look at podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. What's that other one?
YouTube,
YouTube, of course, and what the heck do you call it? The one that WOR has with the radio, iHeartRadio. You can find us
iHeartRadio.
there as well. So, Jason Miller, thanks again for being our guest. We'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.